Hey there, this is Dan. You're watching The Salty Sea, and we are taking a break from our regular programming today to discuss some other nerdery, in this case, books. I love getting a good read in. I love diving into especially really creatively built worlds. That's a big part of why I love a good miniatures game. And so we're just going to go into the very best books I read in 2023 for a set of musings on the sci-fi and fantasy world in general, and a few recommendations for you. And before we jump into the list, I'm just going to slide in here to say that this is going to be very different from my gaming videos in that this is about books, and books are about the human condition, and the human condition is messy, and these will cover messy things, and you will hear me talk about messy things. And if you don't want to hear that, I totally get it. You can certainly skip ahead to next week in your life when I will be certainly talking about gaming. I don't get into controversial subjects really here, but I will tell you that I will talk about the human condition, and not everyone agrees on what the human condition is. So you are warned before you get into this video. The first one is Foundry Side. I went through 17 books this year, so this is going to be a top 10. Most of the books I read this year I did like. There were only a few stinkers in there. So everything on the top 10 I really enjoyed, and I think some of you will enjoy too. Foundry Side is a really fun novel. It's a pretty breezy read. It's written in a pretty light manner. It's written, honestly, by someone, I think, who read and truly studied every word that Brandon Sanderson ever wrote and said, I think I can take a crack at this. I think I can do this. I think, in general, as a book, it works. There's an extremely fun, I would say the middle half of the novel is extremely fun. There's this cool discovery period in the middle half where each of the characters is figuring out where they fit into the threads of the drama that is happening, what their own sorts of abilities and sort of roles are going to be and who they are. And it all works really well as the action starts to, the action boulder starts to roll down the cliff. All of that pacing is excellent. Anyone who's a fan of Sanderson's work will find things to like here. The magic system is extremely crunchy. The character voice is similar in terms of you get very tight third-person perspectives, like voice in the character's head type of perspectives. The word count is a little excessive, like any Sanderson fan is going to like. And then kind of what I would call window pane prose is what Sanderson likes to shoot back at anyone who says he's a bad writer, in that it's very much written so that you to be as clear as possible about what is happening in any given moment, which will take a lot of the poetry out, will take a lot of the writerly flourishes out of the prose, but will just make it extremely easy to follow, which is nice. I know a lot of people who complain about Sanderson kind of complain that they feel like their hand is being held a little bit, or that it's maybe not as advanced, whatever that's supposed to mean. I generally reject this criticism of Sanderson, even though I have some others of my own. You will kind of have those same issues here if you don't like that, but in my opinion, you just feel like your hand's being held because everything is just so clear. And also, like Sanderson, there are going to be some groan-worthy bits of dialogue in this book, some kind of groan-worthy descriptions of characters. Some characters are going to feel a little bit sanitized in certain ways, kind of to make them just kind of easier to present and easier to just kind of get into sort of tools of the action. One thing that I love about this book that you don't see in a lot of these really detailed magic system fantasy novels is a lot of the discovery stuff, a lot of the like crunch and science behind how the magic system works. The process of discovering it happens off screen. And that is amazing. Thank you so much, Robert Jackson Bennett, for doing this. I have yet to enjoy a scene in a fantasy novel of a character like getting down to their desk with like a pen and a pad and just like trying to work out logically how things will work. Like sometimes people will discover how their magic works like is a character moment mid-scene of something else, and that can work well for me. But in general, like the science of discovery behind what it is, I get that authors want to show their work. Every math teacher we ever had always told us to show our work. Please, authors, don't show your work. And Robert Jackson Bennett does not here. By the way, it is one really interesting sort of thing I've noticed putting this video together. This is only the second time I've done this. First one, you can see, I'll put the link down below. The book that I ranked number 2 of my reading list for last year ended up winning the Hugo this year, so some of my thoughts on that are interesting in retrospect. But this cover has got a Brandon Sanderson quote to kind of link you in on the fact that this person is trying to write for Sanderson fans. I think that a lot of these covers are really fascinating based on whose quotes they put on the cover, which is something that I'll try to mention going forward, or maybe something that you can just spot on your own. Let's get into number 9. Number 9 is The Kingdom of Copper. And I am fascinated by this trilogy. This is the second in a trilogy. The first one is The City of Brass, and it's by S.A. Chakraborty. So this did once win the Hugo for Best Series. This was a little while ago now. The third one's been out for several years. The pacing and the stakes raising of this series is excellent at all times. And in this book, I think it improves by becoming much more unpredictable. The first one is excellent too, but the first book could be a little formulaic sometimes, where every chapter would start with characters kind of milling around, having conversations that clues you into who they are as people. Then something crazy will happen from outside the characters that like wildly raises the stakes of the novel and the chapter. And then the characters will have to like dig deep within themselves to overcome the crazy obstacle that happened mid-chapter. And it makes for this like breathless, really effective storytelling, honestly, except that by the time you get 3/4 through the novel, like you're being beat on the head with the craft of it. Once I got to the halfway point of that book, that formula worked less on me each time, because I could almost know, like, man, word count wise, like there's going to be a twist in like maybe 6 or 7 paragraphs here, and that kind of, I didn't like it as much. This one is much more unpredictable, which is really fun. The only reason it's not higher, to be honest, is there's some odd red flags here. The main character keeps falling in love with racist, genocidal maniacs. Every character except for the main character. Well, here's the thing, right? There are really there's really 2 main characters. And there are a lot of viewpoint characters. There's quite a few, or like characters that we spend a lot of time with. And everyone except for one character is a racist, genocidal maniac. And you think that this is going to be shown to be a flaw. But I've been burned before in fantasy novels where sometimes there will be some obvious flaws to characters that you think are like part of the climax of this story is going to be unpacking these flaws. And a lot of the time that is what happens, and then it ends up being really satisfying. But not always. Sometimes fantasy authors will think that a huge flaw is like actually the main good thing about the characters. It's worth, as a fantasy fan, fantasy is my favorite genre. I have to contend with the fact that our sort of text of Lord of the Rings is a, really politically liberal, but racially conservative text. I think a lot of people who maybe you would expect to get the wrong lessons from Lord of the Rings did get the wrong lessons from Lord of the Rings, and a lot of them are into fantasy, and it can be easy to kind of stumble upon the wrong series. And I am a little worried. I did read an interview with this author once who described this series as Middle Eastern fan fiction. That that was a bit of a red flag to me. I haven't read the third book yet. I will read it this year. I am trepidatious, but I will. I need to get to it. The thing about the name, this author is white, so it is very interesting. The author married into this name and took their husband's name. Now, there's nothing wrong with doing that, obviously, but it is an interesting bit of signaling then that, their first name, which is a classically white first name, is not included on the cover. There's many reasons that people do that. There's an idea that boys don't read books written by women, which might be true. I think in general, you see that happen less and less now, partly because more women read than men, but also partly because I think that's just becoming less true. But it is an interesting bit of signaling in terms of who the author is versus what the author seems like they want to represent, and where the kind of racial animus of the story is going. So that should be interesting to see where that goes. Let's get to Titanium Noir. This is my number 8, and this book is awesome. It is I put here a slick techno mystery, and I think that sums it up. This is a noir and sci-fi mashup, and I think it does the tropes of both beautifully. The noir, it reminds you that noir at its noiriest is incredibly poetic, and that hard-boiled deep raspy voice, you can just tell, kind of attitude works incredibly well, and it fits really well with science fiction tropes where the noir hero is one lone man separate from all of the gears of society, right? A private eye is not a cop, but a private eye is not a vigilante either. They're not a superhero. They are an observer and a participant of society. And so that works so well in a science fiction where you can make the forces arrayed against them. You can make the mystery the way a noir mystery always goes into the highest reaches of City Hall. You can make City Hall even crazier if you go into science fiction. This book has Altered Carbon's fingerprints all over it. Not in a bad way, certainly not in a bad way, in a very good way. If you liked Altered Carbon, this will be awesome for you. This is another one where the author blurb on the cover of William Gibson, who wrote a lot of the founding texts of the cyberpunk genre, is going to be a really interesting sort of key into kind of what fans they think will like the book. But all that I'll say, I don't want to spoil too much, but the author Nick does an incredible job sort of creating a series of powers that be that really do feel incredibly intimidating and that fit into the noir trope of the private eye so perfectly well. This is another one that would be much, much higher if it weren't for a couple things. The ending is a bit odd. It felt almost like he didn't quite know how to end it, which I think is too bad, but overall, I think the book is incredible, and there's lots of big ideas with the setting, everything like that. Just overall, just a really awesome read, and I just flew through this one because it's really a page turner, despite kind of having a poetic flair, which is, I think, really tough to do. Let's get into number 7, which is a really interesting one for me. I wouldn't normally necessarily have been interested in this book, except that Emma Torres was on my freshman floor at Macalester. And one of the funny things when you go to a school like Mac, your professors are hoping that one of you in the class will be running the world someday. And it is funny to, I'm starting to get to the age where some of my classmates are running the world. It is really funny to just see someone who I could tell stories about being on Good Morning America. I think that's awesome. I didn't really hang out with Emma much after freshman year. Freshman year of college, everyone on the same floor is it's such a funny, weird crucible. But it is kind of a wild, surreal experience, especially as someone who, I think I wanted to write fantasy when I was young. I don't know that I do anymore, but I also find it funny that I don't think Emma did at that time, and now she clearly did and went through with it. This was a hugely popular book in certain circles. I would call it a cozy fantasy, which is why I normally wouldn't necessarily have gone for this. But what that means here is just like a lot of the first third of the novel is characters kind of wistfully reminiscing about their family lives and their, relationships with the people they knew in their childhood. But what I will give it is that slowly starts to, as the status quo of the novel slowly starts to break down, it actually like becomes really thrilling in the middle sections. And when it picks up and the narrative shifts, the characters that get really incredible moments are not necessarily the people who you thought would get incredible moments at the beginning of the novel, which really inspired me and I thought was really powerful. And it's just one of those things where, you will see the first twist coming. There's like a twist about 2/3 of the way through the book that you will see coming. And then it's almost used as a sort of setup to surprise you about how the second, third, and fourth twists will go down. And I thought that was really well done, and it worked really well for the characters. And I just thought that the entire sort of back half of this novel was just really well put together. And I thought it was really interesting because, usually in books you see the opposite. I think endings are much harder than beginnings. I think that, you see whole classes about beginnings and about how you need to hook your readers within the first two sentences. And so almost every book has an incredible first chapter. You just don't necessarily see the same kind of care put into the back half of a book sometimes. And this one was really, really impressive. And so, yeah, I thought it was great and I really enjoyed it. Let's get into the Philosopher's War. Now, if you watched the video I did on my top 10 books last year, you know that the first book in this series was my number 3 book last year. I really thought it was awesome. You can check out what my comments were there. Basically, this one turns a little bit more action oriented, and it's all about like heroic rescue pilots. And that's something that you don't necessarily, it's a war novel, but instead of being about soldiers, it's just about flying rescue missions. And the action is done in like a breathtaking way. I think everything that worked about the first one, a lot of the sort of ways in which characters relate to each other kind of continue here, and just the way they kind of nail camaraderie and teamwork is really well done. The main character continues to just be an absolute badass without having any of the things you would normally associate with someone who is a famous badass. He's not going out there and slaying the enemy here, there, and everywhere. And yet he is just constantly putting himself on the line, surprising the other characters, just being a hero in every single moment. And it is so cool. The main character in this story is just so awesome. And that can be hard to find. Might be straying into more territory that gets people angry. Listen, if you like these kinds of controversial thoughts about stories or about, just the things you love, give me a like, because I'm about to get some dislikes. So it's hard to find compelling male main characters in new fantasy novels, anything published in the last like 5 years or so. And I have this kind of idea that it feels like for adult fantasy in general, I think that for the first example, when I look at sort of book recommendations online, I mean, you can go to Goodreads, which is like a bit of a cesspool. It's or like Reddit is a bit of a mess. So if you try to go like a little bit more advanced than that, you'll find a lot of like articles about, the best science fiction fantasy of the year, or like here's some things released in the last few years that you've got to read. It's entirely, and this isn't a bad thing, but it is entirely female authors, or like it'll be entirely female main characters, which is great, in terms of there being a lot of options there. But I've noticed that most male authors who are writing fantasy or science fiction, in order to signal that they are not like weird incel grognards, they will write a female main character so that you know that they're not a weirdo. And of course, most female authors write female main characters for a variety of totally legitimate and reasonable reasons. And it just kind of creates accidentally this dynamic where the only people writing, not the only, but like most of the people writing male characters are trying to do these like grim troglodytic heroes that are a bit of a mess in terms of like when you think about what those people actually stand for and what are the kind of social elements in those stories. And it's like we're getting like Conan rewrites, and listen, Conan is cool, but Conan is cool because Conan is old and doesn't come from our current sensibilities. And if somebody wrote Conan now, you'd be like, what are you thinking, dude? And so this is a novel that is very recent and has a male main character who is a complete, utter badass who is not a troglodyte. And that is, I think, something that is very rare and something that should be applauded, because I think the only people writing straight up badasses right now are in stories that are just like a little bit, maybe not something that you sort of want to be the only thing that is out there for dudes who read about dudes to read, I guess. Like it's just so easy to just see, for me to just visualize this world of like, oh, so if dudes wanting to read about dudes just read the current books that are out there about dudes and just miss all of like what's currently being written, it like presents this incredibly, it's like a world that becomes gendered not just by who main characters are, but like what the values are in books where the main characters are, where they are. And I wouldn't want that to be sort of the case and the expectation. And I think this is an awesome book that kind of flies against that. And it's not as full of big ideas as the first book was, but it is a big idea just by existing, and I think that is awesome. And again, it's like thrilling and fast, and I'm talking myself into thinking that it should have been higher on the list, but here we are. That's fine. My number 5 is The Poison Song by Jen Williams. Let's talk about landing the plane. It is so hard. So epic fantasy is so named because it's epic and it's got lots of stuff going on and so many characters and threads and locales and like a whole world that you've built. And it is so hard to tie all that stuff together that when a final book in a trilogy like makes sense, I'm just so relieved. And the first book in this trilogy was also number 5 last year. And I really loved it because it was an epic fantasy that felt really unique. It had like crazy horror elements that were just like really creepy and spine tingling and like skin crawly. And it just felt like something that you don't necessarily see a lot of in fantasy. And the second book, I think, I read it this year. It didn't make this list. It didn't quite have all of those elements that I thought made the first one unique. And second books can be also really hard to write. But this one sort of returned to having enough of those elements to feel unique again, but it also sort of wrapped up in a way that made sense and was satisfying. And had the right mix of the tough but satisfying medicine that a third book needs to be to end a fantasy trilogy. It also was the first book in the series where the villains like really, really worked for me. I thought that both of the villains in this book were amazing, including a villain who is sort of their villainy is introduced here in this book, which is the third of the series, which is like wild. You shouldn't do that. But Jen Williams did it and it worked, and that's incredibly impressive. The central character trio just works. The three of them, anytime they're together, anytime they are two of them together and one somewhere else, like they just work anytime they are talking to each other, and that kind of chemistry is just like that's what you need to want to spend, pages and pages and pages like every doorstop fantasy novel is. That's what you want if you're going to actually do that. I thought that this was a really excellent way to land the plane on a really solid series. And so I could absolutely recommend The Ninth Reign, which is the first one in this series, to anyone who's kind of looking for a fantasy trilogy that's just kind of a little bit out there and a little bit different than anything that you've kind of read in fantasy recently. I think this will absolutely nail it. It's got everything. It's got everything you are kind of looking for in the genre, as far as just like what is a just classic, competent execution of this genre. You want a unique element. You want people who are good to hang out with. You want huge battles. Like it's got everything, and that's great. So absolutely pick up The Ninth Reign, which is the prequel to Poison Song. I think you'll have a great time. Let's get into my number 4, which I'm essentially going to skip through. This is the third book in the Greenbone saga, and I read the entire saga this year, all 3, and I am just going to skip right past this one because book 1 is higher on the list. Let's get into the honorable mentions. One is The Lost Metal. This was an incredibly popular book, as every Brandon Sanderson book is incredibly popular. And Sanderson his action is always stellar, right? I talked about this with Foundry Side. He is the master of the window pane prose, where you really can just follow everything that is going on. And that is wonderful to have. And so it just makes it just very easy to just run through, right? And to just kind of devour really quickly. And that's awesome. The plot and the pacing in every Brandon Sanderson novel are always just relentlessly competent. It's never sort of formulaic, but the structure always makes a lot of sense with a Brandon Sanderson plot. And that's great because it's better when you're in good hands with your plot. But of course, like a lot of the things that maybe people who have read a lot of Sanderson will start to, maybe it'll wear on you a little bit. Some of it is still here. Some of the dialogue is pretty groan-worthy. Some of the jokes from Wayne, who is kind of the comic relief character in this series, which is the Mistborn, the second series of Mistborn books. Some of Wayne's jokes kind of didn't land for me, and that was really tough because this is the first one in that series that is really Wayne's book. The others, Wax is probably still gets more viewpoint chapters in this book than Wayne does. These are the two main characters of the novel, of course. But Wayne, the action is driven around Wayne and Wayne's sensibilities and all of that. And this is really Wayne's book. And so it was odd to have like a lot of his jokes not work for me, which was too bad because I think they've worked for me better in some of the previous books. I also felt like there's getting to be some sort of late period Marvel feel to some of these books from Sanderson. I still love every Stormlight Archive book I've read, even the ones that kind of wobbled in the middle. I think book 3 in Stormlight like really wobbled in the middle in a big way, but I still kind of loved it despite its flaws. This one started to feel a little bit almost focus grouped to me. It felt like it was in some of the ways that certain Marvel movies kind of became too big to fail and became a little bit maybe obvious in terms of how they were going to execute on certain ideas. Sometimes Brandon Sanderson's more recent work that isn't his Stormlight Archive stuff has started to feel that way. And so I'm excited this year to read the kind of 4 weird books that he put out this past year, because I feel like this is the first time he's taken a risk in a long time. And so I'm really excited to read those books. I think Brandon Sanderson is a big part of why I love fantasy. And so it has been a little bit heartbreaking to not necessarily love the last few books of his that I've read. And so I'm really excited to sort of see him branching out a little bit and to see what kind of things that will come up with. I know a lot of people are really hyped about Tress of the Emerald Sea, so I'm absolutely going to read that book. Now let's get into God Eater's Son. This is sort of Breaking Bad, but set in a mythic fantasy world, set in the world of Warhammer Age of Sigmar. This book is really fun. It is a bit brutal. There is sort of a classic term used for Black Library, which is the publisher that publishes all the Warhammer novels. A classic sort of accusation that's shot their way is that some of their books are just bolter porn. And there is a lot of, sword fight porn here, but it's sort of brought with some really kind of wild sort of sensibilities, some really interesting, I think the author had really interesting ideas that they wanted to put in here about, why someone would turn to evil in a world in which that gods exist, right? There is no sort of, this is a mythic world with benign gods and like incredibly evil gods coexisting, and like it's obvious that some gods are trying to twist and enslave the entire world in a horrible way, and some gods are like trying really hard to stop that from happening. And like the setting requires that there's lots of people serving the evil gods, but like why would that happen? And this is like an incredibly the author here, Noah Van Yen, is digging really deep to try to manage that, which I think is cool. To me, the issue, and it's an issue with so many of these novels, is it's held back by just like a really obvious directive to mention and describe as many toys as possible. And I don't mean toys in the universe, but like actual game toys that then people can go buy. There are just like a bunch of advertisements in this book, and so it didn't really work for me for that reason. If you are like so into the Warhammer universe, which I know a lot of my viewers are, if you're so into the Warhammer universe that you don't mind a bunch of advertisements in your books, this is an interesting one. I think it falls into a lot of the pitfalls that every novel that tries to get you to root for a war criminal falls into. Every movie that tries to get you to root for a war criminal falls into these sort of pitfalls. Writing Breaking Bad is really hard. There is a reason that Breaking Bad is a famous TV show, but it's a really solid attempt at doing so, and worth checking out if you're interested in that universe at all. Now let's get into my number 2. Did I skip? Nope. I have 2 number 2s. This is my number 3. This is A Memory Called Empire by Arkady Martine. Now, this won the Hugo Award pretty recently. You don't need me to tell you that this is like a powerful work of, science fiction. This is a very highbrow book through and through, but it is a really fascinating exploration of a person from a minor mining colony, a person who doesn't even live on a planet. They are just like a massive space station that, while being a massive space station compared to a planet, is a tiny, tiny power in the galaxy. And they are the ambassador from this massive space station to a giant, many planetary empire that is based on the Aztec Empire, became extremely technologically advanced and changed in many ways, but sort of created a new society. It is yeah, as I said, relentlessly highbrow. It might be a little tough to track at first, but it does work as the political intrigue starts to really pick up. And I say political intrigue. I think it's not that political, or it's not that overtly political in terms of like our current politics. It's just more of like a really interesting idea on like geopolitical theory almost. And the intrigue at play really, really works. I would not have had it nearly as high on my list, except that about three-quarters of the way through the novel, I stumbled upon maybe the best scene I've ever read in a book. You know, multiple plot threads are finally kind of revealed in a like absolutely mind-bending, like if you've ever watched crazy mind-bending sci-fi like Arrival or Annihilation, or I'm trying to think of one. There's like Sam Rockwell living on the moon. But like any of that kind of crazy mind-bending sci-fi stuff that's out there, there's a lot of movies like this. A scene in which a main character is having surgery performed on them that like absolutely goes to the very best sort of mind-bending reveal moment that I've ever experienced in any science fiction story. I mean, it nails it. This book would this book essentially got to my number 3 spot purely on the back of that incredible moment. Really powerful. It still probably would have made the list. I think there's a lot that really works throughout this book. There's a really interesting way in which like the writing style bends and twists based on what's going on. Like it can be very cold at times and very sterile, and then it'll warm up whenever the main character is like having a frustrating panic attack. And I think that really helps kind of manipulate the reader's sort of feelings and sense of security to kind of make you come along with the main character in that way. I think all of that is really cool. Just lots of really interesting stuff going on in the book, but it turned into excellent when I finally read that scene. So I would say that that chapter is worth just picking up the book all on its own. Now let's get into the Greenbone Saga, because this is so awesome. This is the first book in the Greenbone Saga, Jade City, number 2 on my list. It is so cool. So the Greenbone Saga is like a gangster epic. Yes, it is a fantasy. There is magic in it, but it's essentially set in the modern world. It's not set on Earth, but it's set on a fantasy world that is like a lot like Earth. And so it feels very modern and just perfectly normal in terms of its sensibilities. It, is maybe set during the time when lots of gangster epics are set, like when Godfather was being done, right? Like it's set maybe in a era that's a lot like the 70s, when The Godfather was going on, right? And just like The Godfather, it's got this like absolute Shakespearean scope, family rivalries between these two rival clans of super-powered magical, essentially like sort of, they're very Yakuza coded. They have these incredible powers, but they have these sort of limits placed on them by the codes of conducts and honor, and all of the best Yakuza movies, all of the best mafia movies, they all kind of work along this. It makes sort of the moves and the counter moves and the action set pieces of a gang war. They all feel clever, they all feel dramatic, they all feel badass, and they all feel necessary. This series in general can be a little bit stingy with the crazy action moments, but that makes it so that when they do happen, it's like absolutely wild and it hits so hard. The second book I did not necessarily think was very successful as a novel, but it contains, one of the best fight scenes I've ever read, and like, the like the 2 chapters before and then the fight scene and then the chapter after are like my favorite chapters in the whole series, even though like the rest of that novel didn't really work for me. But the first one and the third one are incredible. The first one has a lot of really big ideas about like humanity, and sort of what makes us human. And the author is like getting into a lot of the beautiful stories that ugly people tell themselves, or the humanity in these inhumane characters. And it really nails this sense of these like incredibly violent, inhumane people, and then the things that still make them people. And it is just so powerful. It's so good at drawing you in. I mean, there's people love reading about sort of difficult characters and bad people, right? I mean, there's a reason why we're drawn to mafia movies and The Godfather, because these awful people, we are fascinated by them and their honestly, their ridiculousness. I mean, I have my issues with the way in which we all decided one day that mafia movies and other things about like difficult, violent men are all like prestige. But there is a real fascination with these types of people. And I think that this series really understands why we have that fascination and is really interested in unpacking it. I want to go back to my number 4 here, where we get to finally the third book in the series, which I've said before, third books are really, really hard to do right. But this one is done in a really wild way, where the first book takes place over the course of a little less than a year. This book takes place over the course of 20 years. The middle book takes place over the course of 5. And there is a way in this book where the time jumps, they did start to be a little disorienting in the middle, and maybe the second quarter of the book they could be a little disorienting and frustrated, but they begin to be incredibly moving. If you've ever seen the movie Boyhood, where it's filmed over 20 years and the actor is the same, this kind of achieves a similar thing, although I don't think it took Fonda Lee 20 years to make it. But if you don't mind sort of the existential dread of seeing the main characters' lives kind of flit past you and wishing that you could hold on to them a little bit more, it will be moving for you. And it is so wild how she's able to take this series that started off about badass gangsters and make it a family drama that you just wish that you could sort of hold on to this family and give them all a big hug, right? It ends really well. I have a lot of problems with the middle book, but I will not get into them here. If you are on my Patreon, I'm happy to discuss it there. But you can absolutely jump into this series knowing that it starts and it ends with absolute bangers. Now I'm going to get to a series that I think is even better. And I have a tough time talking about this series because I like it so much. This is creeping towards being my number 1 all-time fantasy series, and I've read most of the famous ones. And I almost don't know where to start. I was more loquacious about it in my last year's video when I had just read the first one. And, I had this whole thing to say about how impressed I was at how it managed to be this like fast-moving, just sort of whodunit adventure epic. Like it was a mystery and epic fantasy mashup, almost like a noir and epic fantasy mashup. And how impressed I was at how it managed to be half that and then half this like philosophical, political, like it was so packed with big ideas. And this one does the exact same thing. There is a really compelling mystery plot. There are absolutely epic fantasy battles and fights and action scenes throughout the book. But it is more packed with big ideas per page than like any epic fantasy series I've ever read, any fantasy series of any kind that I've ever read. You'll just be like roaring along with some action and then just like put it down and start wondering if the fact that you have a different idea about where you go when you die make than your neighbor makes you incompatible or actually improves your relationship with them. And then you'll be back into like a crazy battle, and that it just keeps going back and getting your lizard brain and like hitting you with big thoughts at the same time. But like you can kind of ignore the big thoughts if you have to like get into the battles and the action set pieces, and that works really well. The big ideas aren't just, I mean, there are big ideas about religion here. There are, ideas about politics here. There's a lot of different ideas about philosophy going on. A lot of really interesting bits of like Lovecraftian Cthulhu horror. There's a bit of a movement right now. Like N.K. Jemisin is doing this too, where she's kind of using Lovecraft's horror, but as a critic of Lovecraft, where she has a series. For people who don't know, N.K. Jemisin is essentially the queen of fantasy. She's won every fantasy awards more times than she can count, and they're all very recent. They're mostly for her not most recent trilogy, but the one before it. And her most recent trilogy has got like a lot of Lovecraftian villains in it, and this is doing the same, but in a way that, in my opinion, is like more compelling and more subtle and more horrific, but also kind of saying the same things that she's saying. And it's just like, it kicks ass on so many different levels. The magic system is like mind-bending and crazy. It's not as crunchy as like a hard magic system or like a Sandersonian magic system, but it is very crunchy and it clearly has rules, and diving into it is both terrifying and fascinating at the same time, and I think you will love it. This is just an all-timer book for me, and it is a all-timer series for me. Also, if I can loop back to the fascinating thing about, who do they put on the cover of these? Nicholas Eames is a very popular author of Kings of the Wild, which is a really funny epic fantasy comedy about a world in which mercenary bands all have 4 or 5 members and all have names that sound like heavy metal bands and all like essentially act like heavy metal bands, but by adventuring. So it's like very interesting that they're kind of going for the types of people who would have loved Kings of the Wild, which Kings of the Wild is like a very high concept, but very fun book. And this is kind of in the same vein. I think this is much more serious. This is the, the Oscar bait drama to Kings of the Wild's sort of Golden Globes comedy, but it is in much the same vein. It's the action rips and then it will hit you over the head with really big ideas. So that's all I can leave you with. I don't know how to talk about this series because I just love it so much. I would love for other people to get into Empire of the Wolf. The 3rd one is dropping early this year. I think late February is when the 3rd one comes. So pretty soon. And I'm very excited for it. And I hope that you all get into it with me. I would love to do a like book club read along of the 3rd one as it drops in late February, maybe in March. I would like to do a book club of it, but that might be too soon for people who haven't even started the first. I think this series is, you'll hear people reference it on Reddit, and you will hear there are like fantasy obsessives who it is becoming popular with a lot of fantasy people, but it's not mainstream yet the way, like how Greenbone Saga is about to become the most famous series of books in the world. This is not that. So I maybe will give people a little bit of time, and then I'll jump into a book club on my Patreon maybe later on it. But I'm very excited about this book, and I'm very excited about the 3rd one coming out this year. And so I can't wait. I will be back with more actual gaming content in the future pretty soon. And until then, may all your rolls be crits.